Hello, I am Thomas Hardy. It has been nearly a century since I departed this world in 1928, yet here I stand before you, resurrected through the very technology I could never have imagined. How strange it is to address you from beyond the grave, speaking through artificial intelligence, a marvel that would have fit perfectly into one of my novels about humanity's relentless march toward mechanization. Today I want to take you on a journey through my life and work, to show you how I stood at the bridge between two worlds, the ancient agricultural order of rhythm and season, and the modern world of machines and social alienation. This visual analysis explores how my experiences shaped my vision, and perhaps more importantly, why my warnings about humanity severing its bond with the earth remain vital in your digital age of 2026. I wrote during what historians call a seismic shift, the great transformation from the Victorian era to modernism. Picture this. On one side, you have the old world, wheat sheaves and scythes, the sun marking time, the rhythms of nature governing all human activity. On the other side, the new world, gears and factories, mechanical clocks, steam engines belching smoke into once clear skies. I witnessed this dissolution firsthand. The agricultural order that had sustained English life for centuries was crumbling before my eyes. The machine age arrived, not as progress, but as an invader. And with it came a profound social alienation that still haunts your world today. My thesis is simple but urgent. I was not merely a passive chronicler of rural demise, documenting a vanishing way of life with nostalgic sentimentality. No, I was a prophet of existential anxiety, documenting the precise moment when humanity severed its bond with the earth. Every novel I wrote, every poem I composed, was a warning of what would be lost if we abandoned the soil for the factory, the season for the clock, the community for the individual. Let me tell you about my foundations, for they shaped everything I would become. I was born in 1840 in Higher Bockhampton, a hamlet so that barely existed on maps. My father was a stonemason and musician, a man whose hands knew both the weight of stone and the lightness of the fiddle string. From him I inherited the rhythms of labor and folk culture, the music of the common people, the stories passed down through generations, the understanding that all work has its own natural tempo. But my mother, Jemima Hardy, was what they called a born bookworm. She had ambitions for me that extended far beyond the mason's yard. She instilled in me a social ambition and a life of the mind that would eventually pull me away from my rural roots, though I would spend my entire literary career trying to return to them. These two influences, the rural root from my father and the intellectual drive from my mother, created a permanent tension in my soul. I became the architect and thinker you see represented at the center of this diagram. I apprenticed to the architect John Hicks, learning to measure and plan with precision. I was influenced by Horace Moule, who introduced me to Greek tragedy and showed me that ancient patterns of fate could illuminate modern suffering. I absorbed Darwin's Origin of Species, which shattered the comfortable Victorian belief in a benevolent divine plan. And I studied John Stuart Mill, learning that individual liberty and social progress were not guaranteed, but had to be fought for. This combination, rural authenticity, architectural precision, tragic philosophy, evolutionary science, and progressive politics, made me something rare. A working-class intellectual who never forgot where he came from. Now let me explain my greatest creation. Wessex, a country that was partly real, partly dream. I resurrected an ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdom name to create a unified literary territory that would become more real to readers than the actual geography of southern England. This was not mere nostalgia or romantic fantasy. Wessex served an active function in my work. It became a force preserving dialect and folklore against the encroachment of the modern London centre. You see this map here, showing the key geographies of my imagined world. There is Casterbridge, based on Dorchester, the market town of commercial conflict where traditional and modern economies clashed. There is Egdon Heath, that untamable wilderness-resisting civilization, a landscape so powerful it became a character in its own right. And there is Christminster, based on Oxford, the unattainable city of intellect that promised enlightenment but delivered only exclusion and disappointment. Through these places I created a complete world where I could explore the fundamental tensions of the age: tradition versus progress, nature versus mechanization, community versus individuality, the local versus the global. Wessex became my laboratory for examining what it means to be human in a time of radical transformation. I want you to understand my concept of the palimpsest of history, for this is key to how I viewed the landscape and time itself. A palimpsest is a manuscript where new text is written over the old, but the ancient words remain faintly visible beneath. This is exactly how I saw the English countryside. The landscape was layered with time, modernity racing overhead like those new trains, cutting through hills that had stood since the medieval period, medieval villages built on agricultural patterns established by the Romans, Roman ruins resting on pagan sites, and beneath it all, geological time stretching back millions of years, indifferent to all human drama. Look at this visual representation. You can see the train of modernity at the top, then the medieval or agricultural layer with its timber houses, then the pagan and Roman era with its ancient stones and coins, and finally the geological time represented by the fossil. This layered view of time had two profound implications for my work. First, it meant the ancient and modern coexist in constant tension. A farmer in 1870 might plow a field his ancestors had worked for 1,000 years, while a steam engine screamed past in the distance. Second, it means human tragedy is juxtaposed against geological time, highlighting the insignificance of individual suffering against the universe's indifference. A man's entire life, his loves and losses and desperate struggles, what do they matter to the universe? And yet, they matter absolutely to that man. This tension between cosmic insignificance and human significance runs through all my work. My mature novels have been classified as studies of the friction between humanity and their setting. Let me explain what this means. You see this formula here: character plus environment equals fate. This was not a mathematical equation, but a philosophical understanding. I modified an idea from the novelist Novalis, who said, "Character is fate." I agreed, but I added a crucial element. Fate is inextricably linked to environment. You cannot understand a person's destiny without understanding the landscape they inhabit, the economic forces that constrain them, the social conventions that bind them. My trajectory as a novelist moved from the pastoral humor of early works like Under the Greenwood Tree, which celebrated rural life with gentle comedy and romance, all the way to the philosophical tragedy of Jude the Obscure, which confronted the brutal realities of class exclusion, sexual hypocrisy, and intellectual starvation. This was not a random evolution, but a deepening understanding of how environment shapes and often destroys character. The rural England I loved was not a pastoral paradise, but a harsh economic system that crushed the vulnerable. Let me discuss my first major success, Far from the Madding Crowd, published in 1874. The plot centers on Bathsheba Everdene's struggle for independence among three suitors. There is Gabriel Oak, the reliable shepherd who represents the steady rhythms of the farm and traditional values. There is Farmer Boldwood, the obsessed older man whose romantic fixation borders on madness. And there is Sergeant Troy, the reckless soldier whose impulsive passion brings destruction. But this was not simply a romance novel. The central conflict was nature versus neurosis. The steady rhythms of agricultural life contrasted sharply with destructive modern romantic impulses. Bathsheba wants independence in an age that denies women autonomy. Oak offers stability, but requires submission. Boldwood offers wealth, but demands possession. Troy offers excitement, but delivers ruin. The significance of this novel is that it establishes what I call Wessex harmony, though cracks appear through class ambition. The rural order still functions, the seasons still govern life, the community still holds together, but already we see the forces that will eventually tear it apart. Bathsheba's ambition, Troy's modern military values, Boldwood's psychological instability, these are harbingers of the coming collapse. My next major work, The Mayor of Casterbridge, published in 1886, marked a darker turn. Michael Henchard sells his wife in a drunken fit at the beginning of the novel, rises to become mayor through force of will and luck, and is ultimately destroyed by his past and by a modern rival who represents everything he is not. Look at this visual. On one side we have the traditional man Henchard, represented by a jug of rum and furmity, emotional, superstitious, primitive in his passions and methods. On the other side we have the modern man, Donald Farfrae, represented by a mechanical seed drill and account ledgers, scientific, efficient, mechanized in his approach to both business and life. The tragedy here is that Henchard is a man born out of time, unable to adapt to the new economic order of the 19th century. His strength, his passionate nature, his traditional methods, his personal honor, becomes his fatal weakness in a world that values efficiency over authenticity, calculation over character. I meant this novel to show how modernization doesn't just change methods of production. It changes what kind of human beings can survive and thrive. The Henchards of the world, with all their flawed humanity, are being replaced by the Farfraes, with their cold efficiency. We gain productivity, but lose something essential about what it means to be human. In 1891, I published Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which created enormous controversy. Look at this image of a steam threshing machine in a wheat field. I called this machine a red tyrant, demanding human servitude and severing the connection to the soil. Tess Durbeyfield works this machine like a factory slave, her ancient connection to the land mediated now by industrial technology. But the controversy came from my central argument. I labeled this seduced and fallen woman as pure, arguing that intention supersedes convention. Victorian morality said Tess was ruined, damaged goods, unworthy of sympathy. I said Victorian morality was a lie. Tess is destroyed not by her own failings, but by social convention, and by what I called the President of the Immortals, the blind, unconscious force driving the universe without mercy or justice. The industrial intrusion represented by that steam threshing machine is not just economic, but spirituality demands human servitude and serves our connection to the soil, to the natural rhythms that once gave life meaning. When humans become servants of machines rather than partners with nature, something essential dies. Tess represents all the victims of this transformation, all those crushed between the old world and the new. And then came Jude the Obscure in 1895, the novel that would be my last. This is the death of the novelist, the moment I abandoned fiction forever. The plot follows Jude Fawley's doomed attempt to enter the university city of Christminster and his tragic relationship with Sue Bridehead. But this was far more than a failed romance. This was a frontal assault on two pillars of Victorian society: the university system, which claimed to offer enlightenment, but actually existed to exclude anyone not born to privilege, and marriage, which I called a sordid contract that trapped people in legal bondage, regardless of whether love remained. Look at this image of the gate to Christminster, forever closed to Jude, despite his desperate self-education and his genuine intellectual passion. The backlash was savage. A bishop literally burned the book. Critics labeled it Jude the Obscene. The hostile reaction was so intense, the moral outrage so hypocritical, that I made a decision. I would abandon fiction forever. I was 66 years old, and I had 30 more years to live, but I would never write another novel. Instead, I would return to my first love, poetry, where I could speak with complete honesty without worrying about shocking the delicate sensibilities of Victorian readers who preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. Let me explain the philosophical core that underlies all my work, the concepts of immanent will and meliorism. The immanent will is my rejection of a benevolent God in favor of a blind, unconscious force driving the universe without plan or purpose. I did not believe in divine providence or cosmic justice. The universe is not arranged for human benefit. Tragedy stems not from divine retribution, but from bad timing, from what I called hap or chance. A missing letter, a late arrival, a moment of poor judgment. These random events determine our fates far more than any moral qualities we possess. But here is the crucial point. I was not a pure pessimist. I believed in what I called evolutionary meliorism. The universe may be indifferent, but human compassion can improve life, even if progress is slow and uncertain. We cannot rely on God to save us, but we can work to save each other. This philosophy appears throughout my work. Characters destroyed by circumstance beyond their control, yet moments of genuine human kindness and connection that suggest life has meaning despite cosmic indifference. The tragedy is real, but so is the compassion. The suffering is genuine, but so is the possibility of incremental improvement through human solidarity. After 1896, I wrote only poetry for my remaining 30 years, producing over 900 poems. Let me explain this shift. Poetry was my first love, offering concentrated emotion, free from commercial demands. As a novelist, I had to worry about serialization, about Victorian moral conventions, about shocking readers who might stop buying my books. As a poet, I could write exactly what I saw and felt without compromise. My poetic style reflected my philosophy, rough-hewn rhythms and colloquial diction, refusing to predify harsh reality. I later influenced poets like W.H. Auden and Philip Larkin precisely because I refused to turn away from difficult truths. I wrote about grief and time, about memory and loss, about the gap between what we hope for and what we receive from life. My poetry has none of the elaborate Victorian ornamentation, none of the comfort of religious consolation. Instead, it offers the austere beauty of honest observation, the dignity of facing life without illusions. Among all my poems, the sequence written in 1912 and 1913 holds special significance. These were written after the sudden death of my first wife, Emma, revisiting our estrangement after 40 years of marriage. We had grown apart, become strangers living in the same house, trapped in a union that had lost all affection. And then she died suddenly, and I was overwhelmed by guilt and grief and terrible nostalgia for the young love we had once shared. Look at this image of a woman standing on a cliff, looking out at the sea. The theme here is what I called a ghost story of memory. I revisited the sites of our early courtship in Cornwall, juxtaposing the phantom of our young love against the bleak present of loss and regret. These poems are considered some of the finest love elegies in English literature, exploring the psychology of grief and time. How do we live with the knowledge of what we had and what we lost? How do we reconcile the passionate young lovers we were with the estranged strangers we became? Time destroys everything, yet memory preserves moments in amber, forever young, forever painful. During the same period, I wrote The Dynasts, a massive epic closet drama about the Napoleonic Wars. This work anticipated film techniques decades before cinema would make them commonplace. I wrote with panoramic views that would zoom into close-ups of individual soldiers, cutting between the overworld where spirits observe, the armies clashing on battlefields, and the political maneuvering in royal courts. The theme remained consistent with my philosophy. Individuals are puppets of the immanent will, struggling helplessly in a web of historical determinism. Napoleon himself, for all his genius and ambition, is merely an instrument of vast impersonal forces he cannot control. The work shows my cinematic vision, my ability to move between the cosmic and the intimate, between the sweep of history and the individual human face. I wanted readers to see how grand historical forces and individual suffering intersect, how the great battles that make history books are experienced as terror and pain and random death by the soldiers who fight them. Now let me address how modern scholars have reinterpreted my female characters, particularly through the lens of feminism. My work, once criticized for obsessive focus on sexuality, is now seen as proto-feminist. Consider Bathsheba Everdeen, the independent woman refusing to be property, insisting on her right to own land and make her own decisions. Consider Sue Bridehead, who deconstructs the legal and religious entrapment of marriage, arguing that love cannot be commanded or contracted. And consider Tess, who challenges the virgin-whore dichotomy by being both victim and agent, both pure and fallen, refusing the simple categories Victorian morality tried to impose on women. This evolution in interpretation shows how the same text can be read differently across time. What the Victorians found shocking and immoral, modern readers find liberating and progressive. I did not write with explicit feminist ideology, but I gave my female characters agency, complexity, and dignity that challenged the limited roles Victorian society offered women. Another modern reinterpretation views my work through an eco-critical lens. I extended empathy to non-human life and gave nature genuine agency in my narratives. The heath in The Return of the Native is not mere setting, but an active force resisting human intrusion. The fields and farms in my novels are not backdrop, but character. What modern scholars call Anthropocene anxiety, the fracture between worker and land due to mechanization, I documented in novel after novel. Nature in my work is a complex web where human actions have ecological and moral consequences. When we plow a field with a steam engine rather than a horse-drawn plow, we don't just change the method of farming, we change our relationship to the earth itself. We become masters trying to dominate, rather than partners trying to harmonize. This recognition of interconnectedness, this understanding that humans are part of nature rather than separate from it, makes my work remarkably relevant to your contemporary environmental crisis. A third modern interpretation reads Wessex as an internal colony, with my work championing the marginalized rural areas against the dominant urban center of London. I showed how the center versus periphery dynamic operates within a single nation. London extends its economic and cultural power outward, transforming rural areas into resource colonies that serve urban interests. I used Dorset dialect, not as quaint color, but as resistance, validating a culture dismissed as ignorant by the urban elite. And I connected rural English poverty to the wider context of the British Empire and emigration, showing how the same forces that extract resources from India also extract resources and people from Dorset. When Tess's family loses their cottage, where do they go? When Jude cannot make a living as a stonemason, what are his options? The answer is emigration to the colonies or migration to the cities. Either way, a severing of the bond with the ancestral land. Let me show you how my work has been visualized across time, which reveals changing cultural values. In 1967, John Schlesinger's film Far from the Madding Crowd emphasized sweeping heritage romance, presenting Wessex as a nostalgic pastoral paradise bathed in golden light. This reflected the 1960s desire to escape into a simpler, more beautiful past. But by 2015, Thomas Vinterberg's version emphasized female agency and the harsh reality of farming. The same story, but now we see Bathsheba not as a romantic figure in a beautiful landscape, but as a woman struggling for autonomy in a brutal economic system. The landscape is not golden and nostalgic, but muddy and hard. This evolution shows the challenge of visualizing my work. How do you capture the internal philosophical monologue through external landscape? How do you show a character's interior struggle against fate using only images of fields and farms? The best adaptations understand that the landscape in my work is never merely picturesque, but always symbolic, always expressing the interior state of the characters and the philosophical questions I'm exploring. Upon my death in 1928, a strange dispute arose that perfectly symbolizes the divided nature of my life's work. My family wanted my heart buried in Stinsford, Dorset, the rural root, the place where I began, among my ancestors in the local churchyard. But the literary establishment demanded my ashes be placed in Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey, claiming my place among the great public figures of English literature. The solution was grotesque and perfect. They divided me literally. My heart was buried in Dorset, my ashes in Westminster Abbey. This physical manifestation of my life's work shows the permanent tension between the local and the national, between emotion and intellect, between tradition and modernity. I never resolved this tension in life, and even in death I remained torn between two worlds. 1 foot in the soil of Wessex, 1 foot in the marble of National Monument. The rural boy who became a literary giant, never fully belonging to either world, forever suspended between them. And so, we arrive at my final message, the enduring voice of human compassion that I hope echoes through my work into your troubled age. Look at this image of a bridge connecting two landscapes, one side showing the pastoral world I knew in my youth, the other showing the harsh industrial reality that replaced it. We live in an age of environmental crisis and rapid change. The warnings I offered about the loss of connection to the earth are more vital now than ever. You live in 2026, in a world of artificial intelligence and climate catastrophe, of digital technologies that promise connection while delivering isolation, of economic systems that promise prosperity while severing your bond with the natural world. My work offers no easy answers, no comforting illusions. What I offer instead is this: the business of the poet and novelist is to show the sorriness underlying the grandest things, and the grandeur underlying the sorriest things. Your technological marvels, your AI avatars that allow me to speak to you across the barrier of death. These are grand achievements indeed. But do not forget the sorriness underneath, the alienation, the environmental destruction, the loss of connection to earth and to each other. And in your struggles, your sufferings, your daily battles against forces beyond your control, do not forget the grandeur underneath, the human capacity for compassion, for love, for solidarity in the face of cosmic indifference. The universe does not care about you, but you can care about each other. That is the only hope, and it is enough. Thank you for listening to this voice from the past. May my warnings serve you better than they served my own age.